Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well. For the last 15 plus years, I've been hammering the point that governments lie to us about the true rate of inflation, that they underreport it. I've shown in many videos the techniques that governments use, and we'll go over a couple more in this video. But finally, the government news channel, ABC News, has, to their credit, reported that some economists, as if you needed an economist to tell you, some economists are suggesting the inflation rate is not being calculated correctly. Let's just have a quick listen to their report here.
More economists now think our inflation rate, the speed prices are rising, is 5% or above annually.
There you go. More than 5% annual inflation, not the 2 to 3% that the RBA claims to target. And I've often said in videos, whatever the official government inflation rate is, it's probably double that. So I would agree with these economists, and credit to ABC for reporting it.
And if you need more bad news, here it comes. A new report says what we call CPI, an index of consumer prices, is misleading.
It is misleading. There is a big difference between inflation, which is an expansion of the money supply, or if you apply it to prices, it's the price of something going up, as modern economists define it. CPI is the Consumer Price Index, and I've talked about this in previous videos. Like, for example, when the Queensland state government gave us $1,000 rebate on our electricity bills and an additional $300 from the federal government, the government doesn't count the price of the electricity going up. If you get $1,300 in rebate from the government on your electricity bill, well, they count that as you spending $1,300 less on your electricity in the CPI. So it's quite misleading. And then let's have a look at, you can see this chart here, how it applies to houses, and I'll show rents in a sec.
Because it doesn't adequately take into account the biggest cost of living, housing.
That's right. For working class families, housing is only counted as 21% of the CPI from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and that's I assume that's correct because they'd be taking into account a lot of retired people who have paid off their house 30 years ago, and they basically have almost a zero housing cost or very low housing cost, just council rates, insurance, that sort of thing. But the average Australian who's renting is spending 33% of income just on rent, not on other associated housing costs. And then people who've taken on new mortgages last year are spending 45 to 50% of their household income on their mortgage, and interest rates are going up. So to only count it as 21% of the CPI is not necessarily the best way to measure inflation. But have a look at this now as well on the screen.
If dwelling prices were included, the report from the Institute of Public Affairs and the Commonwealth Bank's former head of Australian economics contends CPI would have been 155% since 1998, not 114%.
Yeah, so in other words, the CPI is, again, it's not reporting real world costs. It's not capturing the actual inflation out there. And there's no perfect way to calculate it, but I've said it many times before, it's understating. And
Now, rents and the cost of building new homes are in CPI, but mortgage repayments and the cost of existing houses aren't. They say once you include those, and they've modelled two options here for how heavily weighted you'd make it, the surging cost of housing in the past 2 decades would mean real wages have actually gone backwards since the GST kicked off in the year 2000.
So in other words, if they measured CPI, including these, dwelling costs, housing costs, and mortgage costs, you heard the report, I won't repeat it, but if we adjusted inflation for what these economists are suggesting, then our real wages have gone down or have gone nowhere since the year 2000. So 25, 26 years.
Speaking of back...
And that's all we need to look at from that report. But what I was going to show is, let me just bring up my charts here. This is, now this is a year old, but the point remains valid. Rents have increased. So from 2020 to early 2025, you could see the Australian Bureau of Statistics was measuring that rents, or the ABS consumer prices, that's the overall inflation rate. But the Australian Bureau of Statistics was measuring that rents had gone up 17%. Meanwhile, advertised rents in the markets were up 45%. So the government is not calculating the actual increase in rents, in housing costs. When they measure inflation, they're underreporting it because they're calculating CPI. A lot of these people, rents are going up. They're probably getting Commonwealth government benefits. They might be getting rent allowance or other kinds of welfare payments from the government to help them, cover this additional cost. So the government is just counting what the end user consumer pays, not the actual inflation. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And of course, that's the graph from the chart there. And that's the face that I'd make too when I found out that inflation wasn't being calculated correctly. And there is just one more quick point I wanted to show you. Okay, so let's have a look at this data here. This is just a couple of points that I've put together. I talked about the electricity rebate illusion. The CPI only measures out-of-pocket costs when the government uses taxpayer money. So if the government goes into debt, borrows money as our state and federal governments have been doing, they've been borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars to hand you out rebates, and then they say, oh, well, there's actually less inflation because they're only counting the cost you paid on your bill after you receive the government rebate. The government uses substitutions. So here's an example. When beef gets too expensive and you're forced to buy cheaper chicken, the Australian Bureau of Statistics they adjust the CPI basket because they assume, okay, well, beef's gone up 30% in price, so less of you are eating beef, you're eating chicken instead. And there's some truth to that, but they're not capturing, like, if beef went up 30% in price, let's capture these prices going up. Something that's happening beyond that. Let's say if beef and chicken prices and all this got so ridiculous that you've had to downgrade to eating potatoes, and the price of potatoes is flat, the government's saying, oh, look, there's no inflation. What are you talking about? Your cost of living isn't going up. Okay, you might be spending the same amount of dollars on food because you're eating potatoes instead of eating beef or chicken, but your standard of living has gone down. You're living off potatoes now instead of, beef or chicken. And, I think these are factors that happen outside the mathematical equation of CPI that the government has chosen. And I think I think we should just look at the price of things. If beef's up 30%, let's count that. And then if someone wants to say, okay, well, inflation's 7%, but people have downgraded to eating crappier quality food or driving less, okay, that's a conversation to be had outside of the inflation data. I know it's not black and white, but you can see, many of the gripes that I have with the way we calculate inflation. They also do hedonic adjustments or quality adjustments. So what they say is, for example, if a new appliance costs 10% more, but it seems 10% better, if it's more efficient, it works better, the recorded inflation can be zero. So let's say if, I can't really use electronic products because there's a lot of innovation there in terms of, like, we're paying, it's a rapid progression. But say if you buy a car and the car is 10% more expensive than last year's model, but it has 15% better features, the government says, oh, well, the price actually went down by 5%. They don't. The CPI excludes mortgage interest. So as the RBA is raising interest rates, as they have done twice in 2026, and they're expected to do it potentially 3 more times, the CPI, as reported by ABC Government News Channel, and in this data here, this list I put together, they exclude mortgage interest. So if you have a mortgage and your interest costs are going up, that's your inflation is high, your cost of living is higher, but they just don't count that. And then of course shrinkflation, many of you have probably heard that. You get the chocolate block that used to be 100 grams and now it's 95 grams, but it's the same price. A lot of that, and I won't put too much criticism on the Australian Bureau of Statistics or other government statisticians for this, because it's kind of hard to go through the entire economy and find all these occurrences of shrinkflation. But I'm sure we could all agree that the government's not going out of their way to calculate that, and you're seeing it when you buy your groceries. But anyway, hopefully some interesting insight into just a few of the methods that government uses to underreport inflation. And it was nice to see the government news channel acknowledging something that not just me, but many of us in the private sector, in the finance industry, have talked about for 10, 20, 30 years. Some people have been around longer than me and talked about it for much longer than that. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. Cheers.